Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're going to continue with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. We haven't done an endgame video in a little bit, so I thought I'd do one today. I'm just going to talk about king and 2 pawns against king and 1, and I had a very specific position in mind, which is not the one right in front of you. But I thought I'd start with this one just to show you that most king and 2 pawn against king and 1 endgames are relatively easy. For instance, let's move that white pawn on g3 over to a2. If it's black to play here, he's just getting a queen and the game's over, black's winning. So it's not very interesting. On the other hand, let's put the white pawn on a7 instead of a2. Well, this isn't very interesting either. No matter who's to play, white's just going to get a queen. So the ones that are interesting might look a little bit like this, where it's not trivial. Now, if it's white's move here, this is a really easy win. All white has to do is force the black king away from the b pawn a little bit, go over and pick off the g pawn, and then get to one of the 3 squares on the next rank. If you saw my earlier video on king and 1 pawn against king, one of the principles that I talk about, which is an excellent one to memorize because it happens all the time, is if you have a king and a pawn against a king, and your pawn is not a rook pawn, and your king can get 2 ranks or more above your pawn without losing it. When I say above, I mean either directly on the same file or on an adjacent file. So in this case, if you have a g3 pawn and you get your king to f5, g5, or h5 without losing the g pawn, then you have a trivial win. Why? Because either you have the opposition and you can win, or if you don't have the opposition, you could push the pawn and get it. But white can always force that very easily here. Let's show you what I mean. King to c2, it's black's move. He has to retreat. Let's say he goes straight back. King to c5. King d3, king d5. And now white plays king e3. Black has a choice. He can go after the c pawn, or he can try to block the king. But if he tries to block the king, white will push the pawn one more time. And now black could still keep going away from the pawn. White could then have a nice choice of either bringing the king up or keep pushing the pawn until black takes it. Or black can go back toward the pawn, in which case there's no sense for white pushing the pawn anymore. He just goes after the other pawn. And here we have it. King 2 ranks in front of the pawn. In this position, you could put the black king on any square of the board except one that would take the pawn. And white's winning, because white is either going to have the opposition or he's going to get it. So even if we put the black king on g7 or f7, it doesn't matter. White will simply have the opposition already, in which case he would keep it and get the queen, as we showed in the earlier video on king and pawn against king, or he'll push the pawn to get the opposition. For instance, if the black king was on f7, let's put it on f7, then now white, he could push the king, move the king first. So let's say he plays king g5, king g7. Now he plays g4 to get the opposition. King h7, king f6, king g8, king g6, reestablishing opposition. King in the corner. Now we have to just count. King up, king here, pawn up, king here, stalemate. So therefore, it's better to play king here, pawn up, king here, pawn up, king here, pawn up, king here, pawn up, king wins. You just have to be careful with knight pawns. Okay, so if we go back to the original position, king on b2 versus pawns on g4. Okay, so white to play will always win with some care with king to c2, and use the rule if you get 2 or more ranks in front of a non-rook pawn with king and pawn against king, then you're always winning if you play it correctly. Let's say it's black's move. Well, black has a choice. He can go back, or he can go after the g3 pawn. Well, we've already seen what happens if he goes back. If he goes back, let's make it black to move. If he goes back, and white comes up, and he tries to play defense, and white goes here, and black goes here, white goes here, black goes here, white goes here, black goes here. White will simply win the same way again. King here, king here, king here. king d6, king f6, king d7, king f7, king d6, g4, king e5, g5, king f5, g6, and wins. So bringing the king back is hopeless. But if you run your king after the pawn, now we have a counting issue. Not counting in the sense that we're counting like my counting videos where you're looking at trades and seeing if you're coming out ahead. This is counting where we're counting the number of tempos that it takes. Black is going to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to get a queen. White will need 1 tempo to move his king first. He can't move the pawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So even though black goes first, black will be 1 tempo short of queening. And as we saw in the earlier video with queen against pawn on the 7th rank, knight pawns always lose. If you don't believe me, let's play it out. So here we go. King here, king here, king here, pawn up. He still can't come back. It's hopeless. King here, pawn here, king takes, pawn here. Let's say it doesn't matter which way he goes. He has to go out of the knight file. Let's say he goes to f2, c7, g3, c8 queen, g2. And now, as we showed you in the other video, we do check. The best place for black to go is e2, check, f2, check, e2. And now the trick is you don't keep checking him. You go queen g3, threaten the pawn. He has to go here, check. He goes to g1. And now that he's in front of the pawn, you can bring your king closer. King here, pin the pawn, king h1, check, has to go in front, bring the king closer. Now king here. Okay, and now we have, again, we could check. If he goes in front of the pawn, we just keep bringing the king closer. So king to e1 here, and now we get check, king here, check. If he goes king to e1, we mate him. So king here, we bring the king closer. King h2, pin the pawn. Can't go king h3 because queen g1 wins. King h1, check. Here, king here, king f1, checkmate. Okay, so either side to play here, white is winning. White is winning by 1 tempo in the race. If black goes after the g2 pawn, if it's white's turn here, let's make it white's turn, then king here, and we're going to get that rule of getting the king 2 ranks in front of a pawn. Just to show you again, king straight back, king here, king here, king here, king here. Pawn up. Let's say he plays king here. Now I could play king here if I want, but let's just push the pawn. He plays here, push the pawn, he plays here. There's no sense in pushing it any further. That would be a waste of a tempo. Just play king here. He's got to go get it anyway. He's not further away here than he is here, so it would be a waste of tempo to push the pawn. We have another video on that called Rook Pawn. I think it's something like King and Rook Pawns versus King video. If you look at the earlier Endgame video, you can always go to my Endgame playlist. All right, king takes g4, king back, king up, king here. Easiest way to win this is to block him off. King g6. King here, and again we have to count the tempos with a knight pawn, pawn here, king here, pawn here. King tries to go in the corner and get a stalemate. Now it will be a stalemate if I push the pawn. No, it's a check, so I can go there. King here, king h7, check. Anytime it's a check when you go there, it's going to be easy. King back, check here, queen. King h6, queen g4. Forcing him back in front of the king, and checkmate. Okay, so the endgame I wanted to look at, which will take up most of the video, is this one. If you can win this one, you can win a lot of 2 against 1s. All right, so it's white to play and win. So what I suggest is find a friend or get an engine, set up this position, and play it out. Play white and try to win against black. Do that before you watch the video if you can. If you can't and you want to watch the video and you don't want to play it out, you can. But you're going to learn a lot more if you try it yourself first. So if you have an engine, set it up, take white, see if you can beat the engine. If you have a friend around, grab your friend, try to play white, see if you can win. Okay, You can always pause the video when you do that. Let's look at it now. White to play and win. Well, what's the worst thing white can do? The worst thing white can do is probably push the e-pawn right away. If he pushes the e-pawn right away, then pawn takes, king f5, draw. So that's clearly a terrible move. All right, so what else could white do? Well, he can bring the king up, king to g4. This is a famous trap, and it's a good trap to know. Black to play and draw. The drawing move is f5 check. Now white's got a problem. If white goes back to guard the pawn, black simply takes, white takes, king f6, draw. If you don't believe this is a draw with best play, go back and watch my two-part video, King and Pawn against King. Whenever you have a king and a pawn against the king, and your king is not already in front of the pawn and it can't get there because the enemy king is there, then with proper play with the defense, it's always a draw. On the other hand, after king g4 pawn checks, if white takes it, then black plays king f6, and now white's in Zugzwang. White has to abandon the f5 pawn. Let's say king g3, king takes f5, king f3, and again we have that fundamental draw, king and pawn against king. And again, the rule is if you have a king and a pawn against a king and your king is not already in front of the pawn and can't get there because the opposing king is there, then with proper play, it's always a draw. So that means that king g4 is a blunder, e5 is an even easier blunder. That means white either has to move his king somewhere else or he has to play f5. Let's say he plays f5 first. The problem with f5 is it's awfully committal, and it tells black exactly where he needs to go. If he plays f5, black should use what we would consider a distant opposition mirroring technique. He wants to go an odd number of squares away from the white king on the same file. So he would go back to g7. And now basically whatever white does, black's going to do. So the only thing white can really try to do differently is to go straight up because black can't come straight up. But let's try some other ideas. Let's say white plays king to f4 with the idea of playing here. Well, now we already know if white plays here and black takes and white takes and black can get to a square like this, it's a draw. So here black could mirror again and play here. And after pawn up, pawn takes, either king e7 or king f7 would get a draw. On the other hand, white could keep coming around here. And now black would again mirror him, three away, three moves away. King here, and now white's got a problem. How does he lose a tempo? If he plays king c4, black can play king c6, pawn up, pawn takes, pawn up. Black gets it within the square with an easy draw. On the other hand, if white comes back, black repeats the position. If white gets further away, black comes this way now, and when white goes here, black repeats the position. He's got to be a little careful. If he comes in here, he could actually lose with king d3, king here, and now black's the one getting into Zugzwang and could lose. So what black should do instead is just repeat the position. And of course, if white goes for any further like here, now black can play here, and now white's the one who's got to worry about losing the game. So, after check here, let's try king to g4. But what black wants to do now is if white plays king to h5, he wants to play king h7. So just go three away again. And if king h5, king h7, no progress. King here, we've been here before. King here, draw. Okay, so what's the right idea for white then? Well, the right idea is to bring the king around the long side first. King f3. By the way, there's a good principle to use here. If you're in a position like this and you don't know what to do, what kind of plan should you try? You should try a whole bunch of stuff because you know you can't lose. You're the one with two pawns. He has one. You're the one trying to win. If you're not sure what to do, try stuff. But when you try stuff, the last thing you should try is pushing your pawns unless you need to push them now. If you see something and you say, boy, if I don't push this pawn now, I'll never get a chance to push it, then you might have to try that. But otherwise, try things with the king first because you can always go back and repeat the position a second time without a draw. The rule is threefold repetition of position, not two. So trying king moves allows you to go back and try something else. Trying pawn moves burns your bridges, and then you can't play something in the future where maybe the king moves would have been the right move. Notice if you move your king and black ever pushes the pawn, you can just get a protected passed pawn, and this is an easier win. In fact, later we'll see something similar to this. So king f3. Let's say black tries to mirror again. King f7, king e7, king e3, king e7, king d4. Now black's got a problem. White wants to come up. So black really wants to stop him. He doesn't want white's king coming up. It makes the win easier. Let's show what happens if he does that. If black plays king to d7, white will play king d5, getting the opposition. And now, what is black going to do? He can't move away from the pawn, so he has to play this way. And now white can play... Well, white could even play e5 now. And he's threatening to play e6. What's black going to do? If he takes the pawn, white would not take back with the pawn because then the king would not be in front. He would take with the king and get the opposition. King here, king here, king here, king here, and white wins. But what else could black do? Let's bring Stockfish in here and see if he suggests anything for black. He says black's losing no matter what he does. He gives the line now, f takes e5, king e5. We just looked at that. Let's say he plays, I don't know, king f7. Stockfish says just play king d6. And now if he trades pawns, you can take with the pawn because your king is in the tic-tac-toe area. If you don't know what I mean by that, again, I highly suggest watching the king and pawn against king endgame video first as kind of a prelude to watching this one. Okay, so king d6, white's winning. White's probably winning with other moves too, right? Yep, e6 check is also winning, and so on. Okay, so let's go back. All right, go back to the start. Make the video bigger. All right, so king f3, king f7, king e3, king e7, king d6. So the most normal move for black here is to play king d6. But what happens now is we can push the pawn. Now you might say, well, we saw this already earlier. Isn't that a draw? And the answer is no, we reached that position with white to play before because white pushed that pawn too early. Waiting till black is here first and now pushing the pawn is all the difference in the world. Now it's black's turn and he's in Zugzwang. Well, how many legal moves does he have? 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's try them. If he plays king c6, white can now play e5. And the problem is if black takes and white takes, white's just going to bring his king up and win the game. For instance, king d7, king f6, king f8, king g7, and touchdown. But what else can black do? Let's say he comes back. Now white has a choice between getting a passed pawn or getting the doubled pawns and winning the pawns. It's better to get the passed pawn. If you take the pawn, I think black can draw with best play. Let's ask Stockfish. Stockfish says yes. King e8, draw. For instance, if king to d5, king f7, king e5, king f8, if king e6, king e8, f7 check, king f8. We've actually seen this in another video too. And now if white pushes the pawn, it's a stalemate. If he moves the king to guard the pawn, it's a stalemate. And if he moves back and black takes the pawn, he's not in front of his pawn again, and it's a draw. So draw. So white doesn't want to do that. E takes f6 is a mistake. What he should do is play e6 check. All right, so let's go back. e6 check. Black plays king here, and now white has several ways to win the position. He can play king d5, king straight back, and now one of the ways to win the position, believe it or not, is to just give away the pawn to outflank the king. Whoops, sorry, king there is not correct. Well, you're still winning, but you have to do something. So just play here. Black takes, you play here, and now you're going to head for a tic-tac-toe win. King back, king here, king here, king d7, king g7, king here, king takes, king here. Black has the opposition, but it doesn't matter on tic-tac-toe. King g6, king g8, pawn up. He can go in the corner and hope you push the pawn and stalemate him, but if you do, you just play king here, king here, king here, and you win. Good try. Or he can go in front of the pawn, and now you push, and now he's in Zugzwang. King e7, king g7 wins. So let's go back to the start and show this again. King f3, king f7, king e3, king e6, king d4, king here, pawn here. So we just looked at king c6 and we saw that e5 wins. But what if black goes back? Suppose if he goes straight back, white will come straight up. So let's say he goes back here. King e7. Now white should get the diagonal opposition. King here. If black keeps moving his king away, white will bring his king in, Zugzwang the black king away from the f-pawn and win. So if black plays here, though, white plays here. And now, if black plays away from the pawn, of course, white wins it. If he plays here, now we elbow him out. And we don't even need, as we just saw, we don't even need the e-pawn to win this position. We're going to elbow him out. He's going to lose the f6 pawn, and then we'll have a tic-tac-toe position, even if we only had one pawn. And white wins. Tic-tac-toe. Doesn't even need this pawn. All right, let's do it again. King f3, king f7, king. Notice don't push the pawns too early. If you do, it tells black where he has to go. Even now, if you play here, black simply plays something like this. And now when white goes here and black goes here, it's white's move, not black's. And it's a draw. So that's not what you want. What you want is to play king here first and see if he plays here. If he plays there, then f5 will win. But if he doesn't play there, let's say he plays king here. Well, but now I can play king here, and he's in Zugzwang again. If he plays f5, I play e5 and get the protected pass pawn. And if he goes back, I bring my king in, and I win. We already looked at that. So king d6, f5. So we've looked at king c6. We looked at king e7. Really doesn't matter if he plays king c7. I guess white could push the pawn here, but I would just play king here and get the opposition. King d7, king d5. If he plays king e7, then king c6, and we outflank him, elbow him out, and we get the pawn again with tic-tac-toe. In this case, if the pawn was further back, if it was on a lower rank, where it's not tic-tac-toe, we'd be winning with the extra pawn. Since it is tic-tac-toe, here's the tic-tac-toe board right there. Again, refer to my earlier video on king and pawn against king. If we're in that tic-tac-toe area and we're in front of the pawn and we're not trivially losing it, then we're winning no matter whose move it is. Okay, so now we can sort of see that bringing the king around to d4 is the right answer. That's the win. e5 is an immediate draw. f5 is a draw, but it's tricky. King g4 is a draw. King h4 makes no progress. What you want to do is wait till you get to that magic position. King here, and now black's in trouble. We just saw if he comes up, he loses. If he stays back, he loses. But the key position is he tries to get the opposition, and you put him in Zugzwang. That's the win. Now, are there other ways to win? Well, okay, if he plays king here, and you play pawn here, and he plays king back, and you play pawn up, and he plays here, we already saw the easiest win is to play e7. e7, king takes, king c5, and now you got the diagonal opposition, king d7, king d5, king e7, and there we are. There's our elbow out position. And as we showed you before, we're going to win. Black keeps getting into Zugzwang here. And now, tic-tac-toe win. Doesn't matter that black has the opposition. If he goes in the corner, we just play king here and here. If he goes king f8, f7, king e7, king g7 wins. Okay, so Is that the only way to win? Well, no, it isn't. You have other ways you can win here. F5, king here, pawn here, king here, pawn here, king here. So E7 is the fastest win. Another way to win is just march your king around the other side of the board. Now that he's stuck watching this pawn. So now he can't play king H7 because you get a queen. So he has to play king G7. How does white win here? Well, white wins with the same kind of tic-tac-toe stuff we saw before. You simply push the pawn as a decoy. King here. Push it again to get him off of the square. He goes here, you go here. Now you have two squares where you can attack the pawn. He only has one to guard it. King G7, black's in Zugzwang. King E8, king here, king here. We've been here several times. White's winning no matter whose move it is. If it's black's move and he moves out of the way, you just come up diagonal and you win. If it's white's move, move out of the way. He tries to block, you push, and as I said, if he goes in the corner, you move your king F7, E7. If he plays here, you win. So when you get to this position, I think there's actually a third way to win. Let's go back to that position. So in this position, the fastest way to win is to sack the pawn. The second way to win is to come around this side and then sack the pawn. The third way, I think, is to try to outflank him by playing this way. And when he plays there and you play here, he can't keep going with you. He's got to come back. And now your king can make progress and start to come in. And now black's got a problem. If he plays king here, you can play here. If he plays king here, you play here. If he plays king E8, you play E7 here, and you get a queen. So I think something like that works. Maybe black had a better defense there, but it doesn't much matter. So if you can win this endgame up a pawn, king and 2 pawns against king and 1, if we add more pawns to the board, let's say we make it 3 against 2, does that make it easier or harder? Well, the answer is it makes it much, much, much easier. Because now when you push a pawn later, when you bring the king over, and now when you push a pawn and he takes and you take, this is now a win, not a draw, because the fact that he has his king in front of your passed pawn doesn't matter. He's got a second pawn which white can eventually win. Let's let Stockfish play both sides here. Stockfish, what's the easiest win? King D4. He says king E7, king C5, F5, D6 check, king D7, king D5, king D8, king E6, king E8, king F5. You get the idea. And white's winning. So 2 and against 1 is tricky. The more pawns you have, the easier it is, because you have extra pawns you can win, and you don't have to worry about that king and 1 pawn against king draw stuff, because once you trade off some pawns and the other pawns are vulnerable, you just win. So if you can win with 2 and 1, then adding more pawns to the board makes it easier. Now, I have a video earlier called King and 5 pawns against King and 4, where we start with something like this. And compared to what we just did in today's video, this is much, much easier. But you want to do all these videos and get the technique down. It's called technique when you have a winning position and you know how to win. Technique is the strategy you use to win a winning position. So I had an earlier video, King and 5 pawns against King and 4. And this is also relatively easy, although it uses a different technique than the one we just saw. The 2-on-1 is much, much, much harder. This is much easier. When you have a lot of pawns and you have that extra pawn, unless your opponent has something special going for him, you're probably just winning. Okay, hope you enjoyed the video. Best thing you can do for me is tell your friends about my videos, my YouTube channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you want to subscribe, great. If you want to like the video, thanks. And we'll see you next time. Bye.